it seems to me that there are scaling issues here. That is, the kind of model that fits is going to depend on the scale.
Absolutely.
So if the scale is, I mean, you can see sort of houses is a natural chunk. But some, you know, if you model it on a block, on a city,
Yeah.
you're going to get very different equations there, right?
The equations won't differ. The parameterizations may differ. So, in fact, you know, so there are a number of ways of thinking about this. Okay, and so let me see if I actually have some data here.
Well, I would think that the actual, not just the parameterization, but the equations might differ.
Well, I mean, the equations could differ. Right? I mean, I wouldn't argue that this is the only possible model that's out there. But you know, if you look at this at different scales, you end up with the same broad conclusions that self-excitation is driving things, right? And we've done this in the case of Iraq. And when you look at things for districts as opposed to fine-scale events, you get a self-excitation process out of it. Now, I would argue that the reason why you have self-excitation at larger scales is because you have self-excitation at finer scales, right? And in fact, you know, if we go back to this, and this particular model suggests that that's the case, right? I mean, this model is aggregating over space, and you can choose whatever your aggregation window is, right? Mm-hmm. And in this particular model, using particular counting procedures, events are going to follow that nice straight, deterministic line, right? If it follows this heterogeneity process, so you can choose whatever scale you want to aggregate over here. And if it follows this, then it's about persistent heterogeneity. If it doesn't, then it's about self-excitation, and it appears to work over a variety of scales. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the only model that's out there. I'm saying it's one model that makes sense both sort of ethnographically and statistically.
Well, when you said it aggregates over scales, it's only up to a point, right? If you take cities, they're all going to look the same. Right? You wouldn't see hotspot cities and not hotspot cities.
Well, but
right?
you might
say that the scales go up.
No, but I mean, we haven't done this, so I don't know exactly what would happen. But if you were to take all of the cities in the U.S. and you were to try and do some sort of counting, I mean, it becomes problematic, right? Because
they differ on a whole bunch of dimensions.
Well, okay, so actually, it's more about counting of events. That's where the problem lies. Because if you aggregate over very large spatial scales, then it's difficult to know how the order of events frequently in those cases.
Because what I meant was, in some sense, the self-excitation is driven by individuals.
Yeah, the self-excitation is
higher up
driven.
in scales,
Right.
You don't have these higher scaled agents who are sort of choosing, oh, that city's easier to hit than this city.
Right, it's a question of the degree.
The process isn't the same all the way up the scale.
Well, yeah. So, it's a question of the degree to which the self-excitation process is being driven across those scales by individual behavior at the lower scales, right? I think that's part of the question. Yeah, Carol.
I found that really interesting, and I liked your expanding your model to war on Iraq, for instance. And you went on to say that you thought this explained all different types of crimes. I wonder if you could really talk about the set of crimes that you're talking about, because I was thinking about rape, for instance,
Right.
murder, for instance, domestic violence, for
Right.
instance, and those don't necessarily seem.
Well,
I don't know. So I'd like you to.
So on the one hand, we don't deal with those crimes. I mean, we explicitly exclude those types of crimes. But in terms of domestic violence, I mean, domestic violence is the classic example of repeat victimization, where individuals are they've learned some sort of pattern that they can exploit, and so I would hazard to say that domestic violence is all about repeat victimization. And if you do look at the victimization surveys, that's the case. I would also say that even though we talked about violent crime and burglary here, anybody ever found that restaurant that is just amazing, right? You say, oh my God, this is great. You go there for like 5 times in 2 weeks. And then you're like, oh God, I can't eat another, father's office burger, again, and then, you trail off, and then you go back again, and this is, I hazard to say that this is not just about crime, right? This is about human behavior.
But that, your example suggests that if you vary the scale in time, there's a self-limiting thing. You hit the house twice or 3 times, but not 15 times.
Well, okay, so in the case of burglary, for the data that we have, I mean, there are houses that are hit 7, 8, 10 times, right? I mean, those are pretty rare, but I mean, if you give us 50 years worth of data, you're gonna see a lot more, right?
Yeah. Well, the question is whether there's a factor at the other end, negative excitation, where you exhaust something.
I mean, that's possible as well, that, eventually a place gets hit so many times that there's some sort of negative excitation. And in fact, if you look at the way the data actually pans out, I mean, this is simulation, but the data actually looks like this, right? Here it's above the line, which suggests positive excitation, and here it's below the line, which means that, essentially into that would be committed out here independently on the tail are being pulled up into nearer time, right? So you do have negative excitation built into this conceptualization, right? So it's pulled positive here and it's pushed negative out here. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. I think this might have been what Carter was asking before, but it is interesting in the crime data that there doesn't seem to be an effective response by the victims. That they say, well, I got hit once.
Right.
I mean, obviously, the police are telling them something different, but, so you put bars on your windows and you put an alarm. It doesn't seem like and this is different than in so that part of the dynamic seems to be absent from the burglary data, but present in the crime, in the gang data, where people are responding actively to what's happening to them in their what is an appropriate way, or appropriate. But,
Right. Yeah. Oh, you mean so the retaliation is happening
I mean,
on.
there you're looking at both
Right.
both sides of dynamic, and
Right.
it's generating this pattern. Here you're only looking at one side of dynamic, and it's generating the pattern.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So it's like a 2-party versus a 1-party
Yeah.
situation. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about it in a
Yeah,
while.
so why isn't the homeowner getting a gun and shooting at the guy who comes through the window the next day? In other words,
Well-
the burglars are learning, why isn't the homeowner learning?
Well, the homeowners may be learning, but I mean, in California, those are great examples, right? But so in terms of actual calibration, right? This peak is happening within 2 weeks of the first event, right? I mean, you're not going to get bars on your window in 2 weeks, no way, right? And you're not even probably going to clear, background check for your gun in 2 weeks, right? You might, right? But a lot of your responses, are likely to take longer than the timescale of this process, right? And on top of that, people, you might cast some of this in future discounting, right? I mean, I just got hit. Your natural response is, well, I'm not going to be hit again, despite what the police are going to say, right? And so you say, the risk of getting hit again is not that great, when in fact it actually is great. So I would argue that people are not particularly vigilant in this case.
No, but if you get, I wonder if that's really true, that model. Because, if you get robbed in the street, walking home at night in the dark, seems to me you aren't going to do that. I think the first thing is what is it that put me at risk, and I'm going to not do that.
A lot of people, listen, so it's something I didn't talk about, but one of the fundamental aspects of this sort of modeling approach is something called routine activity theory of crime, okay? Very famous theory, and it basically says that crimes are generated by offenders, victims coming into contact with one another in the absence of effective security, right? Okay? And second, that it's really the routines of daily life that generate all of those opportunities, right? So I know I get grumpy when I can't buy an Americano down in the coffee shop, right? Because that's my routine, right? I don't want to change my routine, right? People who go out partying late at a bar where they know there are lots of bar fights, right? They don't want to break that routine, right? People who have to go to work, right? even though their house was broken into, they don't want to break that routine. They can't break that routine. And so, you know, those routines are, you know, are pretty malleable in many ways. And so I would hazard, and this is conjecture, that the flexibility to, you know, change is not nearly as great as you would think. Now, I love the way you suggested that. Well, the gangs are responding, right? Whereas the homeowners aren't. Oh, I have to think more about that.
Well,
That's
it's
interesting.
your account of what's going on.
Yeah.
That point, though, raises a question, which is that you say that the police will use this prediction formula.
Mhm.
What will they use it to do? If it's to increase law enforcement activity, then by your hypothesis, that will not deter these criminals. They're in a routine crime pattern. So
Yeah.
what are we doing with the prediction?
Well, that's the question at hand, isn't it? I mean, there are multiple possible outcomes with that, right? It could have an impact, right? And therefore, the model changes fundamentally, right? Or maybe it doesn't have an impact, right? And in fact, it's already built into the model, right? Because it's not like police don't do anything when there is a gang shooting, right? Again, remember, you know, from our perspective, crimes are occurring because motivated offenders are coming together with suitable victims in the absence of security. And, you know, it's impossible for police to be at the location of a crime for the most part, right? I mean, burglars are rarely ever caught red-handed, and gang shootings are rarely ever averted, because these things unfold in the matter of minutes at a street corner when there may not be any police present at all, right? So I mean, there are interesting implications for that. There are interesting implications for whether or not you can use these sorts of ideas for prediction and what sorts of impacts. In the case of burglary in the UK, they had very effectively used this observation that if repeat burglaries are going to happen, they happen very quickly on the heels of the first event. And so in the UK, but not in very many US cities, the police go to the homeowner and they say, you were broken into. There is a high chance that you will be broken into again. Be extra vigilant. And then they go to the neighbors and they knock on the doors and they say, your neighbor was broken into, right? Be extra vigilant because the chances of you being broken into are also high. And statistically, they saw a big drop in residential burglary as a result of those policies that were implemented in the mid to late 90s. So there can be an impact. Yeah, Joe.
This is about the street justice and the necessity to retaliate quickly. If you wait a couple weeks, you might as well not bother.
Right.
But then I think of the expression, revenge is a dish best eaten cold, and how in the history of terrorism and counterterrorism, there's a number of instances in which the retaliation came long after the thing that it was retaliating for, and it occurs to me that there may be a kind of trade-off where to organize a really, really big counterstrike, you need time, and you can still restore your reputation even after a long time, as long as the counterstrike is of large enough magnitude.
Sure.
Is there any way to incorporate that?
Absolutely, because, so we haven't done this, but, the earthquake models obviously take into account what? Spatial location, timing, and magnitude, right? If you could collect information on magnitude, right, you might see it having exactly that sort of effect, right? I might speculate that on the street, people don't have access to those kind of resources, right? And so, the resources that are at hand are fairly limited, and so you better employ them, pretty quickly, right? And that would be my sort of off the cuff explanation for why that's the case. Yeah, Clark.
I was sort of continuing on that thread and some of the questions that Alan was asking. I was wondering about the dynamics of the Hawks process, because it doesn't have a damping function, right? So
It does.
Oh, it does.
Yeah. So it's an exponential. Yeah, this term right there is an exponential decay. So
Right, except is that actually, I mean, what that says is that if an event hasn't occurred, the probability,
Declines back
Declines.
towards some,
but it
based on
doesn't,
normal.
but is it damping in the sense that the number of recent events increases the, or
decreases the likelihood of more
Yeah.
events? No, that's not built in. But recognize, I mean, maybe this is what Alan was getting at before, that this particular function right here could be swapped out with any, you know, any range of,
Sure.
of self-excitation process. You could have one that starts out low and it accelerates and then declines, or, you know, any number of things. This is just a sort of
I mean,
simplest,
it
simplest.
seems like, to me, I mean, the sort of intuition that I have is that it's like, you know, you have fault lines or whatever, right? There's some built-up tension in the fault.
Right.
You shake that out.
Right.
After it's been shaken out a bit, you go back to a baseline.
Right.
But I'm wondering about the psychology of vendetta cycles where, so they happen where I work, in the Schwar where I work.
Right.
And, you know, people get tired of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. There's some literature suggesting that they're self-feeding and that they're very difficult to extinguish,
Sure.
precisely because
Right.
people
So
hit each other back. But then, you know, it could be, well, you know, we've had 4 killings on either side.
people
Let's
get tired of it.
end this thing,
Right.
right? And then they do have mechanisms for sitting down and saying, look, we all know what's going on.
Right.
Let's just finish this. Let's make a deal.
Right.
That would not be captured, if I understand
It
correctly.
it sort of is captured in the following sense, right? Okay, so there are two components to this model, right? There's this sort of background rate that generates things out of nowhere, and then there's the self-excitation component, right? And when you look at the actual data, right, you get, you know, some sort of blood feud that starts up, and then it goes for a while, and then it peters out, and then there's a big long gap, and then it develops again and goes on. Now what you're, you know, this is statistical fitting, what your interpretation of it is in terms of motives and, you know,
Yeah.
the history of two clans or gangs and what have you is, you know, sort of a little bit of a separate issue. I mean, you want to be consistent with motive, but, you know, here would be, you know, people get tired of what's going on, but the rivalry doesn't really disappear, right? It sort of simmers at this
Right.
low level, and then somebody disses you again, and then it flares up into this big,
But the question is, why doesn't it explode exponentially? If it's really self-excitation,
right?
then it should explode exponentially. What's the thing that keeps it, what's the thing that stops it at the end of each cycle?
Randomness.
It can potentially.
It could potentially do that, but, you know, stochastically, randomly through time, you're going to, you know, you'll have a series of events, and then eventually you'll just, for whatever reason, random reason, you'll hit that point and it will decay back down to the baseline. Because no sort of follow-on event happens, right?
It looks more chunky.
I mean, well, so,
It's a small series here, but
I mean,
it looks more like it has a damping process in which it ends itself after a while.
well, I mean, all I can say is that if you go through and you fit the model, right, the statistical properties of, you know, what's the size of the clusters, how many events are there, what's the spacing between clusters and those sorts of things, is, you know, is pretty consistent on a statistical level.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you could have, you probably don't have the power, but I mean, the kind of thing that I'm suggesting, maybe Alan's suggesting, would say that the decay
Mhm.
is going to be faster after a larger number of events in succession than it would have been if there hadn't been.
So that's
Right? And you could probably test that.
that would be a reasonable model. I mean, it would be swapping out, you know, the terms of the model, and that may lead you to a better fit.
Yeah.
It may lead you to a better fit. Now, there, you know, as you well know, and I've heard a lot of you say Ikaike, you know, in here before, right? You know, there's a balance between, you know, model complexity and
Sure.
and what's going on, and I don't have it here, but, you know, we've done a whole series of comparisons based on Ikaike's information criteria, you know, weighting complex models versus non-complex models, and this strikes a balance between simplicity and statistical power, right?
Yep.
Which leads to advantages. I mean, listen, for this, so if I were any sociologists in the audience, okay, you know, you give this talk in a different context, right? And this would come off really crazy. Any sociocultural anthropologists in the audience? Carol, thanks for coming. I mean, listen, this strips away a lot of complexity, right? It strips away, I mean, it's consistent with motives, and it's consistent with complex, you know, intergroup dynamics and all these sorts of things. It's consistent with it, but it's not in there, right, in an explicit way, right? And so the balance you strike is, well, some people might say, well, you know, how can that possibly be realistic, you know? It depends on the perspective you're coming from, right? It fits the data, it leads to tractability, and other sort of positive outcomes in that sense.
It might be interesting to put in, you know, to see if it's improved by any kind of psychological
Yeah,
parameters of any kind.
absolutely.
I mean, presumably minimal ones, but
Yeah,
things,
absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, so if we had a better understanding of exactly what you suggest of, you know, how much is too much, right? And that you have some sort of dampening process where people just get exhausted. And if you could capture that,
Well,
here-
or the thing that you mentioned with reputation, because
Right.
if you had some kind of measure of the function that maps between time since recent
right. Yeah, I can imagine you
event
could-
and reputational damage.
I mean, it'd be great to do this with emails, right? And, you know, somebody sends you an email that just pisses you off.
Right.
You look at the time frame between when you respond and what is your response,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I would argue that it's probably pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
That, you know, if you're gonna just send a small little zinger, it's gotta happen pretty quick, right? And if you're gonna sit back and think about the biggest bomb that you can imagine in an email, you're gonna spend some time crafting it, and then you're gonna go, oh God, why did I send that? Oh, no.
Or not send it at
Or
all.
not send it at all because you hit the
Calm down.
delete key, yes.
And do the benefit cost ratio.
Yeah. So I imagine it would be very similar.
Yeah.
Or we can talk about, you know, the Schwarm, you know, how you would collect data
Well,
and
what's
measure that.
interesting there about, which is sort of relevant to what Joe was saying, is if you have a cultural rule that says you have to retaliate, right?
Right.
Then it's, I mean, it seems to create a different kind of atmosphere because the other side knows
They know,
it's going to happen.
right?
And so what happens is I mean, I know of cases where people 5 years later, some guy went out of his house to go to the bathroom and boom.
Yeah, yeah,
Because, you know, the guy waited for just the right moment
right.
to sit outside of his house with a shotgun and wait for him to walk
Right.
out there. And I mean, that's got to create a different dynamic too, because you know that
Right.
it's coming at some point.
Well, the gangs know this too. I mean, they know that that retribution is going to happen, right? But it's escalating, right? So this captures magnitude, right? And this is the way these things go down. And there's a guy named Andrew Papachristos who's came out of Chicago recently, a PhD in Chicago, and he's looked at gangs in Chicago, South Side, East Side. And you know, these things escalate from two guys meet at a corner that's sort of part of shared territory. You know, one guy goes, you know, Blood's Rule or something like that. You know, I won't pretend to really mimic what exactly happened, but you know, it starts out with something small, and then the other guy comes back and says something else, and then, you know, it escalates on a short time scale, and then boom, right? And then the reprisal comes back, and it's well documented. So, Christina.
So earlier I thought one of the intuitions was that you could chunk crimes by how depletable the resource was, and that would differentiate how some of these reputation-based kind of retaliations. But actually, I mean, it may be worth considering just depletability of different types of resources. So in the case of the burglary, the fact that you know that there's nothing left there, or in the case of the retaliation as well, I don't know, some sort of manpower or
Sure.
time or
yeah.
ammunition. I don't really know what is the finite resource here, but
So, well, there are a couple of ways of thinking about that. In any given house, there may be a finite
in
resource.
the house there's a finite
In the-
resource.
yeah.
In the case of gangs, are there finite resources that need to be recouped that would be considered in this
So
time to?
So this Andrew Papachristos has looked at this, whether it's, you know, for gang violence, whether it's reputation, and whether that reputation is spurred by, he calls it symbolic capital or something, or whether it's based on something like drugs or money, right? Some sort of tangible economic product. In the vast majority of instances, it's not about, I mean, at least as far as he can tell, it's not about finite economic resources. And now whether there are bounds on reputation, whether it's a finite resource. I mean, for individuals, it's a finite resource, I imagine. Yeah. Lower bound, upper bound, I don't know. I mean, actually, I haven't thought an awful lot about that, but it's kind of interesting. So, yeah, Joan.
So the first model that you talked about,
The persistent heterogeneity.
so that, is that the sort of model, formal way of talking about the sort of broken window model that our former police chief was?
Yes.
Well,
No. Well, so in some ways, yes. I mean, broken windows is horribly misunderstood. And actually, James Q. Wilson, who's
Right.
he's here,
Yeah.
he's a professor emeritus here, right?
yeah,
And broken windows has multiple potential interpretations, right? The interpretation that was deployed by Bratton was clean up the small stuff, and you prevent the big stuff from happening. So you clean up the broken windows, and the bigger crimes don't happen. Now, what was the mechanism?
yeah.
The actual mechanism was, the guys who are doing the small stuff are also doing the big stuff. So you lock up a guy when you catch him for doing something small, and you remove him from the system for doing big stuff. Now that's the way it was implemented by police, but broken windows has become, it's become this. I'm saying going one way. It's become this, right? It's become
You
that
get rid of
an environment
the-
has a broken window, and you see the broken window, you go, I'll crawl through that broken window, right? I mean, it's become
And
a,
it's okay to do this kind of thing,
right,
right? I mean, so that's what I was struck by when we were talking about these.
right. I mean, this is a fascinating study, this one right here.
Yeah.
I mean, this right here makes your case about opportunity, right? That, you walk up to the Starbucks counter, right? And there's nobody else in the store, and the barista hands you a 20 instead of a 5 in change. And there's nobody else there, and she's totally focused on you, and you go, and then you go, oh, I'm sorry, you gave me the wrong change, right? Another circumstance, you walk in, it's totally packed, she's completely distracted, hands you the 20 and turns around to make the next latte, and you go, windfall, right? Never happened to me, but opportunities are created like that because of environmental variability. That's the argument, at least.
Why does that count for the persistent heterogeneity model and not? Because I would think the same kind of thing, like a queue.
Right. So actually,
Crime happens, accuse people here.
I've sort of mixed what's going on here. The argument would be the argument here is that there are some environments that are like this, and there are other environments that are like this. These ones are going to have very frequent repeats, and those ones are not going to have very frequent
But
repeats.
Jeff, I want to follow up that because it seems to me that those two models are not so, the persistent heterogeneity and the self-excitation, because the story you give about the self-excitation is that you discover the heterogeneity. The story you've given us is that the burglar discovers that this house is different from other houses. And therefore goes back again, not because of not because of the previous burglary, but because of the information that led to the first burglary in the first place. So he walks around, he sees an unlocked door, and then he commits a series of burglaries because of that unlocked door. So it isn't really I'm asking about the mechanism here because those models don't seem to be different the way you described them.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that way. So it's possible that there's a hidden persistent heterogeneity that's out there, and that the burglars are just discovering that heterogeneity.
So it's not that the first
Right.
burglary causes the second burglary, it's that
Right.
both burglaries are caused by
Right.
a new piece of information
Right.
which they come across.
There's no heterogeneity, it's just that they sort of, well,
Oh, there is.
there is,
You
yeah,
just have to discover.
right.
Okay. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Which is
That's a-
different from the fact, I've committed the burglary and that makes it easier in some way to commit the next burglary. That's a different story, because I've committed the burglary at random.
Right.
Now that I know what's inside the house,
Yeah.
it's not that that house is different from other houses, but now I have special knowledge because I committed the burglary.
Well, it could be a little bit of both going on. So, I'll have to think about how hiding heterogeneity impacts this.
If they chose a house at random and having been successful,
Right.
nobody catching them, nobody.
That's the
nobody-
self-excitation.
Then they go back. But if
Okay, so-
they've been casing the house, right?
If they
and
look
they've been
around and they
casing 10
found an easy
houses,
house and then they keep hitting it over and over again because they've discovered
Right.
the heterogeneity.
So, in a neighborhood of this size, right, okay, the burglars are all gonna be local teenagers, okay? I would argue that if this were the case, and this is totally speculation off the top of my head, but I would argue that very quickly they would discover what the underlying structure of this environment is, in a small enough environment. And as a result of that, you would end up with, over a relatively short period of time, the expectations of the persistent heterogeneity model. And that's not what's happening, right? But I mean, I'll have to think about that on a larger scale. It is often about things that are specifically learned, right? They jimmied the window, and the window doesn't get fixed for 3 weeks. They can go back in through that window.
Right.
Or here's another one, right? And this is what burglars report. They broke in, they stole the TV. They know that the insurance check is going to be there within 35 days, right? There's a brand new TV sitting there, right? And they go back and they steal the second TV, right? Or something like that. Or there's a lot of of theft of things that that are quickly replaced in that way. So, but that's an excellent point, Alan.
So the question is,
I'll
what
think about
math would enable you to distinguish between those things?
I don't know, a hidden Markov model of some kind. I don't know. I mean,
Why wouldn't
I
it
can-
work just to ask whether the probability of a repeat burglary on this house is higher than you would predict from the background for that region?
From the background for that.
Well, for that little block, that block has a background probability.
Well, that we
Is
do
the house
know.
getting hit more than the background probability
But
for
that
that region?
could be because that homeowner leaves that house unlocked, and, I mean, so that the burglar doesn't commit, the question is, does the burglar commit the second burglary because of something that happened during the first burglary, or because of information that they acquired beforehand that is then the factor that leads to the first burglary, the second burglary, and every other burglary? So is it the burglary that creates the next burglary, or is it something about the setting that creates all the burglaries?
All I would say is that at present, I would favor the explanation that it's the burglary that creates the conditions for the next burglary, as opposed to persistent environmental differences, known or unknown, right? And the other thing, okay, so look, burglars know their environments, right? I mean, they mostly, if your house is broken into, I would look for the nearest teenager, basically. I mean, they know their environments. They know, they've got a good idea of what's going on around them, right? And so I'm not sure what little, I'm not sure how much of the environment is unknown to them. Right? They might not know exactly what you have in your house, but they've got a pretty good idea.
But that's an argument for heterogeneity, that they're hitting your house because they already know it, not because the second
Not
burglary.
necessarily. I mean, it's something about the event itself that creates the. I mean, it could be something as simple as, okay, so when you ask offenders who are inexperienced versus one that are experienced, right? The biggest problem confronting offenders who are not experienced is fear, right? And so, they don't commit a crime because they're scared of doing it, right? And the moment they break into a house, right, they go, man, that was easy, right? But they're scared to break into the house down there. They're going to go back to that same house again because it was easy, right? And so, what did they learn? They didn't learn something about, what was inside the house, even though I cast it that way. They learned something about their own, their own tolerance mechanisms.
But they also generalize it, you're saying, not to burglary,
right.
but to this house.
The
learning process, they don't.
They specify it to that house.
Yeah, but then
and
the
its
stimulus
neighbors.
generalization is very, very narrow here.
Yeah, it's and we can say exactly in the case of LA that generalization works out about at most to 2 kilometers from the focal house. So beyond 2 kilometers from the focal house, events are occurring basically at random.
Well, so there is a scaling issue.
There is a scaling issue. Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said there wasn't.
No, there is a scaling issue. Yeah, absolutely.
We've got time for about one more question.
Perfect.
No, I'm good.
I wanted to come back to that Iraq data,
Uh-huh.
about the shifting means, or the variable background. I guess it's- the data doesn't matter so much,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
and also Joan's question about changing behavior, not this one, but you said.
Oh, you mean the gang
No,
data?
no, the Iraq
Histogram.
one where you had that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, that one. So, in some sense, the difference between the earthquake, the Hawks model, and a social model is the sort of feedback, this sort of meaning both ends are adaptive
Right,
both sides of the equation sort of can do something about it.
right.
And some of the arguments you made about the houses, in some sense what's going on is even if they could do anything about it, they're constrained. You've got to go to work a certain way, you've got to do a whole bunch of things. So you could have this sort of same process going on both ends, but you stick a constraint parameter on one of them so that it sort of dampens their ability to do something back. And here, the military is responding, they learn about IEDs and they do a whole bunch of things, and the problem is the scale at which they're learning is much slower than the scale at which these individuals are learning.
Sure.
So could you sort of model them as these sort of coupled self-excitations,
Right.
which is one of the, and then you sort of parameterize a constraint on one such that when they're totally unconstrained, maybe you get something like the gangs, but when one is totally constrained, you've got this other thing.
Fantastic idea, yeah, different timescales of response, I like that.
And different spatial scales. So one of the things that I know that the military does is they have even unofficial blogs where somebody says, okay, I found this bomb, it's a new type, and all of NCOs who are dealing with bombs read it.
Right.
And so that the information is diffused very quickly over a very wide spatial area. So, but I think the idea of asking for the spatial and temporal constraints on the two different sides, sort of game theoretic.
Absolutely.
Like a Volterra kind of version.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. Again, I like all those ideas and take them to heart. And thanks for your time. It's been an interesting conversation.
Thanks very much.